Thank you very much. Today's talk is a strange one for me because normally I come in and give a talk. I have an introduction, a method, a results and a conclusion, and it's all very strict and controlled. My talk today is very much an introductory talk. I don't quite know where I'm going with it, but I'm going to give it a go. So it's a bit out of my normal realm of giving a talk. I'm not presenting anything new. I'm just hoping to throw out a way I'm looking at the field at the moment, and perhaps there's a different way of looking at it. Maybe you've got the same approach as me, but I'm not going to bring any new information, which is a bit different from me. But I've coined that word the Otherreal because what I'm going to be looking at today is what reality is in terms of the different ways we can perceive the paranormal, the role of consciousness in that, and how it might impact on what we perceive as being paranormal experience. So, to start it off, I thought, okay, I always like starting off with a story. So I think, well, here's Tim's story. Now, Tim is not his real name, but he probably wouldn't mind me using his real name, but I haven't got permission, so I won't use it yet. But this Tim story, it's a generic story that you've probably all heard a very similar one in some time in your life. But what's happened is Tim works for a multinational company. He's an IT specialist, and he's had a conference one weekend. I think it was probably a weekend or maybe a weekday, I'm not quite sure, but he was in an inner city hotel where the conference was being held for 2 nights. And he was staying upstairs in one of the hotel rooms. This is not the exact place he was at. It looked, so in my mind, similar to what he would have seen because it was a turn-of-the-century sandstone building. He's been at the conference presentations all day. He's come up that afternoon or evening to freshen up before he goes back down for pre-dinner drinks. And as he walks in to unlock his room, he sees the shape of what he will call a man walking across. The man was clean-shaven, dark hair, very pallid, looking straight ahead, dark clothes, was striding with purpose, didn't look around at him, just walked across what was essentially the end of the corridor. Now, he's the only one up there as far as he knows, so what he does is go, okay, maybe that's someone down there. Let's have a look. So he's gone down to the end of the corridor, and it was a T corridor, but of course the T was tiny, a little bit at the top. On the left was a closed fire escape door, which was locked and alarmed. And on the other side, on this side here, was just a window that was locked and closed overlooking a courtyard. It was on the 2nd floor. So immediately, this is a strange experience for Tim. So he's gone back downstairs, having been a little bit shaken up, but not overly concerned. He's gone back downstairs in pre-dinner drinks. He's gone and told everyone. And of course, once upon a time, I would have thought that there would be a lot of ridicule for what Tim had told them. But I've got a feeling that maybe it's the people I hang out with nowadays and the community I live in, which is a normal community up in the mountains, and it's not surprising that people will go, oh yeah, that happened to you. So rather than being a sceptical approach on Tim's story, what he found was that everyone was quite accepting of his story, and it was the talk of the night before dinner. So what is that? What is that? What do they say it is? Well, of course, as we can imagine, they say, oh, Tim, you've had a paranormal experience. And the next step is, well, what was that paranormal experience? Well, it was a ghost. Or you saw an apparition because it appeared. It was appearing in front of you, an apparition. It was a spirit. So these are the words that are bandied around. The next step is to say, okay, well, who or what was this? I think it might be a deceased former resident. And that was the kind of the channel that people progressed through the night. So it was a man. He died there. When did he die? Oh, maybe 1920s. He's hung himself in a room because his business failed. Or he was, some reason. But, that's the kind of conversation that it became. Who was it and why were they there and why were they haunting that particular place? And of course, the issue I put down here is, it's a bit of a warning bell there. Maybe we're jumping to conclusions. We all do that. I mean, in fact, one of the talks potentially I was going to give today was one where I was going to just go in and give a ghost story and all these solutions to it. And I thought, well, maybe that's it's not really the approach I should take as an introductory talk for today. Maybe I should just make this a talk about revisiting the concept of a story, a paranormal experience that someone has told us, and let's start from first principles and work through it and see where we end up. So rather than jumping to conclusions, let's just start with some definitions. And one of the things I want to get across today is the careful use of words. So what we have is an expression, paranormal experience. What is a paranormal experience? What does it mean to have a paranormal experience? Well, the first thing you do is go, okay, what's the etymology of paranormal? It's beyond normal. And there's lots of definitions you can look up about a paranormal, what it is. Generally speaking, they're reasonably consistent. There's some arguments about what actually is, what fits a paranormal topic or what doesn't. So it's a bit of argument at that level. But ultimately, if you think about what the word means, it simply means beyond normal, the same way supernatural is above or beyond the natural. So that's the first thing. Okay, we're dealing with that, beyond normal. What about an experience? You look up what an experience is, it's actually hard to find a really good definition of experience because it's hard to define it. One of the ones I've sort of taken and mashed up and created my own small version of what a definition of an experience is an event that has been lived through with knowledge gained. So this one here, lived through, I should use this, shouldn't I? Lived through there, well, you could say, what's the definition of an experience? It's an event that's been experienced. So it's circular, isn't it? It's really hard to find that. But lived through is replacing experienced to define experience. So that's probably the best way I can define experience in a few words. So what Tim's had is an experience which is beyond normal. It was an event that he lived through and he gained some knowledge. I suppose he gained knowledge because he went downstairs and talked about it, and it was a conversation piece for that night. So from that point of view, you can say, okay, we're getting a bit closer to what happened. It was a paranormal experience based on those kinds of definitions. All right, next step. Where do we go from here? Well, there's a lovely Rudyard Kipling poem. I have 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. I call them what, where and when, and how and why and who. And that's been around for thousands of years, really, that kind of concept. But it's called the 5 W's and an H, and it's used in journalism and policing and a few other things. It's a standard way of trying to understand the components of an experience and how to understand more about that experience. So to make it a bit more formal, here we go, formalising it. What Kipling was saying was there's 5 W's and there's an H. When did the experience take place? Where did it take place? And what happened? How did it happen? Who was involved? And why did it happen? So I thought, okay, well, let's apply this to Tim's experience. Why not? Rather than just jump to the conclusion that it was a ghost haunting the corridors, let's just step through it. We might come to that solution at the end, but we don't know. So this is part of the whole journey of it. So we're going to apply this particular technique to Tim's experience and potentially others. What next? Well, it seems easy to document the where and the when. So where did it happen? I know where it happened, and it was an inner city hotel. When did it happen? It was in August 2016. That's fine. Then you come to the what. What actually happened? Well, there's lots of different ways of dealing with this. There are people, and I'm sort of jumping ahead a bit here, but based on the content of what Tim said, it's immediately, no, don't go any further. I'm not interested in the what. The what is irrelevant, it's meaningless, it's unspeakable, so I don't want to know any more about it. Right? And that's an approach people could take. Even if you're a bit sceptical about Tim's story, you might be happy with what I call the phenomenological what. So you accept that Tim is not hoaxing, he's not making this up. He generally believes he had the elements of his experience were real to him, and you'll accept that phenomenological what happened to Tim. But beyond that, there's a fork in the road. And it's a pretty straightforward fork. You'll all know it's intuitively obvious where you're going to go from here. But I would suggest that most people would probably, even if they weren't happy with Tim's story, yeah, look, I accept the what happened to you at your level. Don't necessarily believe where you take it, but I'll accept that point of view. So far we've got a where and a when, and we've got a what. Now, the fork in the road, this is my simplistic dichotomy. It's the first approach, and it's the approach that Tim's work colleagues took, as well as Tim that evening about what happened. So what happened was real, inverted commas. It was real. It was really happened. It was independent of self. It was independent of Tim. It was a legitimate experience. It was real, it was legitimate. How it happened, how it was perceived, was through conventional senses. That's the assumption they're making. So you saw it through your eyes. It was there, it was down the corridor, it was an apparition, it was a figure that walked across the corridor. It was real, it was independent of self, he perceived it through conventional senses, and ultimately, because how it happened was real, there are potential who's and whys. So that wraps up the whole Kipling style of poetic, 4 5 W's and an H. In other words, who was it? Well, that was the man that hung himself in 1920 in one of the rooms based on a business deal gone wrong. I don't know if that's true or not. I suppose you could look up history and see what kind of people were killed or murdered or committed suicide in the building. You could do that. So there's responsible who's and perhaps why's. He hasn't moved on because he hasn't, doesn't know he's dead. All that kind of conversation you have about potential hauntings and why they happen. So that's your first approach, and it's the standard thing you'd expect people to take if they take the assumption that what Tim saw was a ghost of a deceased person from some previous time who's still haunting that location. Then, of course, there's a second approach, which is to say, okay, what happened wasn't objectively real. It was not a legitimate experience. How it happened was not a function of conventional perception. There might be suggested whys, like why Tim had that experience. There's no really responsible who, because there was nothing independent of self. We'd like to know why he had that, but it didn't happen through conventional senses. He didn't see it as something that was external, that was the energy that hit his retina and so forth. So from that point of view, it's interesting because really it negates the concept of an experience. If you look at the definitions of experience and it talks about an event, and the event is assumed to be something that actually is happening in the real world, if it's not happening in the real world, it's not an event, that technically it's not an experience. So what a person taking the second approach could actually turn around and say is, look, that's not really an experience. A paranormal experience is a pseudo-experience. So a paranormal experience is really pseudo-experience. It's not real in that conventional sense. It's not a true experience. Okay, so that's the second approach. Now, where do we go from here? All right, well, we're going to follow this now. So we've got two possibilities so far. What does it mean to be real? To say it's real or it's not real? Well, defining reality, well, again, it's not easy. It's metaphysical and ontological. So it's, what are the elements of reality is ontological, and how reality is the metaphysical approach. So they're sort of interrelated. They're the sort of the components of reality, and that's so for example, reality is made up of laws of physics. So we're defining reality in this kind of, using these kinds of terminologies. And as you probably realise, it's conventional wisdom, that materialism is a dominant assumption in terms of what reality is. Reductionist materialism, or material reductionism, I've seen it used both ways. The idea that objective reality is made of discrete, hard and tangible matter perceived through our senses, or potentially instruments that can, if we can't see it ourselves, we can use instruments to determine what reality consists of, and it behaves in a predictable manner. So that's a very general definition of materialism, which really, as we can realise, dominates the way we view what reality actually is, what it is to be real. Now you turn around and go, oh, hang on, what about other things? What about quantum physics and relativistic notions? How do they fit into things? Because we know that potentially we haven't got billiard balls running around in tiny billiard balls that are invisible to us, and that's the way the world is, and that's it. That's true, but you can imagine from a materialistic point of view, they say, well, okay, the classical physics that we work with is so disconnected from the relativistic and quantum sides that really we don't have to consider them affecting our standard reality. So they're there, they're playing around at this nano level and beyond, but at this macro level we're living in now, generally speaking, all that washes out and everything's very predictable, and we can talk about reality as being the billiard ball style of metaphor, and that works most of the time, or if all the time, if you're really strictly into this. So acknowledging that those branches of physics do play a role somewhere, you can, to a certain extent, disconnect yourself from that if you feel that they're not affecting the way we live our macro world, in our macro world. Oh, where to now? Well, if you take that approach, you sometimes have to grudgingly acknowledge the role of the conscious observer. Not necessarily, as I might mention in a minute, but you could say, okay, we have a real world, in a reductionist, materialistic sense, that I suppose has to be observed by us. So okay, we'll bring up consciousness. We'll acknowledge that consciousness has some role to play in this. To get a definition of consciousness is even harder to get a definition of reality. So you have to seek it hard. It's hard to seek it, but all tend to be quite bland. So here's it's a typical example you find of what consciousness is. And it's a description. It's not explaining anything, it's just describing it. Consciousness is the ability to reflect on the qualities and content of an aware state of mind. It's about the thoughts and affects, sensations, motivations, interests, identity, embodies self, all these words like this. So these are internal states that we are able to reflect on as a process which is consciousness. So I've got here bland description. It's a description. I mean, you could argue the points of that, and other people in consciousness research would argue, oh, there's no necessary need for awareness, or there is necessary need for awareness. So, you know, there is a bit of an argument over a definition of consciousness, but that's a very generalised statement of what consciousness might mean, and it's not an easy thing to find. The good thing is, from the materialist point of view, is that there's nothing special about consciousness. It's just a byproduct of material interaction. So even though we can try to define it and have trouble defining it, ultimately it's not that important because we have different approaches, monist approaches to consciousness. So we can say that mind is an emergent property of brain activity. So we have brain activity occurring and mind emerges from that, consciousness emerges from that. Or maybe even being epiphenomenal, it's like a side effect. To be an emergent property suggests it has more validity than just being a side effect, which is like, oh, it's just a side effect. It's emergent, so it, you know, it has some kind of role to play, but it's emergent from brain activity. So brain activity is the basis, and it just comes from there. You could even be a bit more radical and say, oh, I don't even want to know about that. I'm just going to think that brain activity is conscious experience. It's one and the same. So there's no need to even try to describe how consciousness emerges from brain activity, because it is brain activity. And once you've done that, you've acknowledged it, but you don't have to think about it too much anymore. You don't have to think consciously about it. There are other sophisticated approaches to this. For example, there's a supervenience theory, which is a bit of a, it's similar, but it's just trying to say, and I've written this myself to try to get in a good passage what supervenience is saying, but it's really, mind is a realisation of the dynamic attributes of the brain. So in other words, the brain is like an egg, and the neurons as fixed material, as like an egg. The activity of the brain is scrambled egg, and from that, consciousness emerges. Okay, consciousness is a sum of the parts, but not really a sum. You can't go backwards and work out where it comes from because it's been scrambled. So in other words, you've got dynamic attributes of the brain which produce consciousness, but it's not a sum of the parts necessarily. You can't go back and say, oh, consciousness is coming from that neural activity there, because it's the actual mystical dynamism of the brain that creates a consciousness. So that's supervenience theory. There are others like that. They're a philosophical dead end, because you can argue all you like about what is the best approach, but you're not actually progressing anything anywhere. You're just fighting over this nebulous consciousness that isn't important in the first place. So that's the approach you can take. And as you can imagine, we're all sort of coming together now. This is a component of scientific reality. So we could say that it's built on materialism, reductionist materialism. We have consciousness that's derived from brain function, whether it's emergent or an epiphenomenon, doesn't matter, it's monist. And there's also the scientific process involved in there somewhere. We're all kind of familiar with the scientific process, but I've sort of thrown a few rules out here. You don't have to take this in too much, but you can see it's all about empirical adequacy, falsifiability, predictive accuracy, and so forth. So you've got these rules that you follow for the scientific process that also are coupled with materialism and consciousness derived from brain function, tend to be a very simplistic way of looking at what scientific reality is. So when I'm talking about reality, particularly from the second approach, it's that. Now, from the second approach, you could say, well, okay, based on the way where I've sort of taken this argument, paranormal experiences, in inverted commas, because they're really pseudo experiences, don't conform to 3, that scientific process. They're not measurable. Now, when I'm saying that, I'm not saying in terms of parapsychological laboratory research. I could say Tim's experience was a spontaneous apparition experience. It was an elusive experience. So we're not able to go necessarily measure that again according to this approach. So therefore, Because it's not measurable in the sense that we require it for scientific validity, it can't be said to occur in the material world. Therefore, paranormal experience is a function of error in consciousness. All right, so where do you go now? So, okay, it doesn't conform to 3, which is from that last one. It doesn't conform to here, the scientific process. So it's not here somewhere, so it must be an error here that's creating that experience in the first place. So where do you go now? If you've taken the second approach, what do you do? Well, if you're a physical scientist, you're probably going to hand it over to a psychologist who is allegedly an expert in consciousness. So that's where the psychologist comes in. And not only are they an expert in consciousness, apparently, although you'd be hard-pressed to find a university course that actually teaches consciousness. Allegedly, their expertise in consciousness, but especially errors of consciousness. And as we've seen from the reductionist materialist approach, an error in consciousness is the same as an error in brain function. So there you're on safe ground. Oh, thank goodness we're back to brain function now. I can study brain function and I can make all these claims about errors in consciousness from that. So far, so good. Okay, so what are errors in consciousness? Well, we've got illusions and we've got hallucinations. And so we all know about illusions. Here's the example of the Canesa triangle, which is, you know, illusory contours and the laws of closure and all that kind of stuff. So in other words, seeing things that aren't there from an illusory point of view. That's interesting, but it's not really going to help us with Tim's experience. This is a much better word. Hallucinations, much better than illusions. Tim didn't have an illusion. Tim didn't mistake something, maybe a misperception of what was out there as physically real, and he just interpreted it in a different way. What Tim must have seen wasn't there in the first place, according to my second approach. So it must be this word here, hallucination, a very much overused word. So what is a hallucination? Perceptions of objects with no reality, right, usually arising from a disorder of the nervous system or induced by drugs. So I've pulled that off a definition of it in a journal article somewhere, but it's very similar. I mean, you try to find a definition of hallucination, it's pretty much going to be that kind of thing, something similar to that, okay? So it's the antithesis of real, no reality, and it would account for Tim's ghost, because Tim's ghost must have been hallucination because it wasn't real. Why did it happen? Well, we'll get into that in a minute, but here we go. So far, we're looking at potentially applying the hallucination theory to Tim. Now, the reason, I'm stepping through this very slowly because we jump to the idea that a skeptic will say, oh, Tim had a hallucination, but why have they got there? And that's the kind of the process that would have followed implicitly that got them to the idea that Tim's hallucination, or Tim's ghost was a hallucination. So what are hallucinations? Well, they're associated with altered states of consciousness. What's an altered state of consciousness? Well, Ludwig defined it back in the 60s. A mental state, again, induced by a physiological, psychological or pharmacological manipulation that significantly deviates from normal waking consciousness. Again, a very descriptive expression of what a hallucination is. So from this point of view, normal consciousness perceives reality, but an altered state of consciousness perceives a pseudo-reality. It's not there. It's come from somewhere else. That's where most people stop it. They say, okay, we know what it is. We know what hallucinations are, we're going to move on from that point of view. But if you want to then say, well, what about all these weird experiences people have, these paranormal experiences? They're not normal, they're supernatural, they're beyond nature. What do we do with those? Oh, they're hallucinations based on some altered state of consciousness that produces the hallucinatory experience. So we've got wholesale application, all sorts of things. Apart from just Tim's ghost story, you can apply it to out-of-body experiences, astral travel, near-death experiences, all sorts of paranormal, beyond normal sensations that people report. But I still want to know, what are hallucinations? So beyond that phenomenological experience of the what happened to Tim? Well, Tim saw a ghost. He saw the figure of a man walking across the corridor, so blah, blah, blah. The story I told you earlier. That's the phenomenological what. But if that's a hallucination, what is a hallucination? So there's the what being used in a different way now. And if you know what it is, how did it happen, and why does it happen? Why do we have a hallucination of a ghost walking across a corridor? Tim wasn't ready for it. He wasn't looking for it. It just happened. Okay. Well, this is where I start getting a little bit interested in what the answer is, because I can't get a good one. We can say that hallucinated material, it's internally derived. All right, what do you mean by that? Well, imagination supplants real percepts. So the stored memories or cultural materials of a person stored in the person's mind or brain is able to derive, it's able to supplant the real visual percept that people are seeing. This is similar to that psychosocial hypothesis. Now that comes, psychosocial was popular in the 90s, we arrived in the sort of 80s and 90s, and first started with the old hag of Newfoundland from an anthropological point of view. Why people in Canada were like having a sleep paralysis type of episode where there's an old hag sitting on them, they wake up and she'd be cackling and breathing horrible breaths into their faces and so forth. And people like Hufford and others would look at that and think, well, we have a sleep paralysis as a type of neurological disorder, but where's the material coming from? It's a cultural material. It's coming forth from somewhere, and it's being sort of overlaid onto that neurological experience to become something that seems real. This has also been taken in terms of other people who've said, well, alien abductions, for example, is psychosocial material. So people go into some kind of hallucinatory trance, and the material that's coming from their imagination, cultural material and stored memories, it's science fiction stuff. And they're bringing it out and they're throwing it out there, and the experience they're having of an alien abduction is because they've seen ET in 1977 or whatever movie or television show it's big. And that kind of psychosocial material is giving the form to that hallucination, which at different social times in history would be different things. I guess, fairy lore becomes alien lore and so forth. And that's the kind of explanation, inverted commas, that is being provided to why hallucinatory experiences are what they are. Now here's an example, because I'm still not happy with that. I'm thinking, well, yeah, but how does it happen? Like, what's going on? And you can't find a good example from that second approach. So what I've done is I've actually, to a certain extent, misrepresented Charles Tart's ideas, which is what I'm going to show you here. He wouldn't have been applying it to what I'm saying, but if I was one of these second approach type people, and I wanted to have to tell me why I felt that Tim's ghost was a hallucination, I'd probably try to create something like this, an analogy like this, what I call the jigsaw analogy. So we have elements of consciousness. This is almost like structuralism. It's like Titchener's work, where the elements of consciousness were introspectively, that's what psychology was, to work out what our elements of consciousness are. And this could be what you are experiencing now. This could be your level of apprehension, and maybe that's your level of happiness. I don't know. They're just elements of what makes you conscious right now. It's making you the conscious person. Down here, we have elements from somewhere else. Now, from a very strict second approach point of view, these elements of consciousness are internal. They're stored memories and cultural material. When I say cultural material, it's not from some kind of transpersonal cultural thing. It's literally over your life. You've watched TV and seen billboards and so forth, and this is all the stuff that's just implicitly being added to your memory, which is represented by brain activity, essentially. So that's lying down here. You're not aware of that, but you're aware of this. These are your current elements of consciousness. Now, for some reason, we have a disruption. That's where the altered state of consciousness comes in. So there's lots of different ways the disruption can occur. It could be through drug use. It could be through drumming. It could be through, extreme happiness and emotional states, lack of sleep. It doesn't matter what it is. There's a disruption. And this gets broken up. These elements of consciousness get broken up. And all of a sudden, some of these other elements from somewhere else, internally, are starting to pop up. Now, my question here is it random? Which ones are going up? I don't know. Yeah, it's random. We don't know why, but certain things are popping into your normal waking consciousness. Once they're there, so these are some new elements here that used to be down here, but now they're up here. Meanwhile, some of these other elements might have dropped down to be stored away. So now we have this new conscious state. You still need a bit of disruption, and you need a bit of patterning. So in other words, once the disruption's gone, of the altered state, then you go back to normal consciousness. But while that's still just there causing the disruption, this state will maintain. Patterning is this idea of creating a pattern that makes sense to you. And I've got a question mark there too, because I'd like to know who does the patterning, but I'll come to that in a minute. So we have this patterning and mild disruption, and this is the new altered state. This is your new conscious state. And that could be something as simple as being completely normal but seeing a ghost walk across the corridor. Because that ghost is some kind of material. And this is what I'm assuming. So I've had to create this myself because no one else is giving it to me. So I'm saying, well, is that what's happening? This was a ghost here from seeing a ghost movie, and now that bit of ghost is here somewhere with all the other elements of consciousness. The more of this that comes from here, the weirder your experience will be, to a point where I guess you can be in a completely altered state of consciousness where reality is not not conventional reality, it's somewhere else completely. But if it's only bits of it that's being disrupted or replaced, then you might have this merging of reality with things that aren't real as part of your experience, that all seems to be seamless and no different to your normal waking consciousness. So that's my idea of how I apply an analogy to this particular state. Then I think, okay, well, consider this. And here's a question, actually, I was talking with Lance last night, and it's an interesting one to think about. Okay, here's a gotcha. This is a gotcha that the second approach would take for out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. And the gotcha is, okay, lacking receptive organs, like eyes, how does a disembodied voyager capture stimuli convertible to true perceptions? In other words, if you're having an out-of-body experience or even a near-death experience, and you're leaving your physical body and you're being embodied in some other way, and you're staring down at yourself, or your sister in this case, or you're on a surgery bed and you're looking up and you're looking down at yourself, who is currently dead and being revived. So it's the same state. One of the arguments, and I don't see it actually used as much as I would have thought, but you do find it every so often. They'll say something like this: well, how can you see that? We haven't got eyes. To see anything, you need eyeballs. And we know that because if you don't have eyeballs, you can't see anything. Right? So that's a bit of a gotcha. So therefore you can't have out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. It's just imagination because you can't see without eyes. So he doesn't have eyes anymore because his eyes are back where he came from, the other room. But look, by extension, you can sort of apply that backwards. You can go, okay, well, a hallucination, assuming that Tim's experience is a hallucination, it's more than just a degraded memory or a reimagined dream. Now, we all know what a degraded memory is. It's like last week, what happened? I went to a meeting last week, and I can vaguely remember the meeting. I shouldn't say this on camera, should I? Oh, it was a great meeting. It was a work meeting, and I can vaguely remember bits and pieces of it. I think I've got an overview of what happened, and I remember snippets, but not in a visual way. I just remember concepts of who I sat with and what happened. It's degraded. It's not like reality. Similarly, a reimagined dream. Now, unless it's one of those big dreams that people have every so often, most run-of-the-mill dreams, you wake up the next morning, you sort of have this snippet of what happened. But that's not a hallucination. A hallucination is real. In fact, hallucinations are a visual experience without visual input. So that's what they're really trying to say. So Tim's ghost is a visual experience overlaid on reality, but there's no visual input coming in. So it's a bit like the out-of-body experience, near-death experience argument. Well, how can you have that visual experience without the use of the eyes? It's a pseudo-experience. How is it created? But I've got an answer to that. You turn around and go, oh, no, that's fine. I can tell you how it happened. There's some kind of neural pattern. I mean, you could be fancy and say it was a neuromatrix. And a neuromatrix is like the expression of saying, oh, there's this really diffuse neural activity that's a bit mystical, but it's there and it runs the brain. It's all very neural, and that explains everything. It's like a very sophisticated neural pattern, and that's active in the visual regions of the brain, and it corresponds to visual experience, which is indistinguishable from reality. So you say, well, okay, I can bypass completely the visual, the eyes, and I can just go straight into the brain, and I can make a pattern that resembles some visual experience, and it will be overlaid on your experience, and it will be indistinguishable from reality. And we know that from entopic imagery. So you can say, okay, I can close my eyes and press my eyeballs, and I see flashes of light. I can sit in a dark room, and every so often I can see a flash of, like a phosphene, like a flash of light in front of your eyes in a pitch black room. It could be gamma rays from outer space that are just going straight into the brain and stimulating the visual cortex in some way that you get little flashes of light. In fact, you can take copious amounts of hallucinogenic drugs, and you can get entopic imagery of the style that anthropologists have been looking at for decades to explain, primitive rock art, and also, later patterns and experiences that people do over centuries and centuries of different cultures, and they seem to have the same kind of form: circles, dots, squiggles, lines, and so forth. So these can be induced directly into the brain without any visual experience. So entopic imagery, and that's what entopic imagery is. It's imagery that you have that isn't caused by the use of the eyes. But we're dealing with sophisticated imagery here. We're dealing with apparitions that walk that seem as real. They look like people. And there are some issues, there are some problems. If you look at the literature, the latest literature, there's not a really good answering of how sophisticated imagery can be put on. I can understand entopic imagery. I can understand flashes of light and balls and squiggles, but sophisticated storylines inserted onto reality is a much harder thing to try to account for. And there are disconnects. I mean, there's some recent stuff showing visual perception and visual mental imagery are different. So, when we have a mental image of something that's happened to us, it isn't occurring necessarily in the standard spaces or places of the visual cortex where visual imagery comes in. It's from different, it's diffuse. So there isn't a really good link up between the two. In fact, you look at some of the research papers that show that the neural correlates of hallucinations are also very descriptive. So, you could say, okay, here's a schizophrenic who sees a person constantly, and here's a normal control person. And look, there's slightly different patterns of activity between the two. In terms of, this might be a visual area, because there's lots of visual areas in the brain. This is one particular area here in the sulcus or somewhere like that. And look, they're slightly different, and that explains why they're seeing the vision, because their pattern's a bit different. And I've talked to a few people now who do this kind of research, and I say, isn't it kind of just correlational? And they go, so what? It's causal, because there's no other possibility. So when you have some kind of pattern in the brain that's a bit different to someone else, that explains the hallucination. That explains why they see, in the case of a schizophrenic, they see their father keep coming to them and standing in the corner. And from a schizophrenic point of view, it's usually more auditory, but when I'm talking about visual hallucinations, it's much rarer. But if it does happen, that's what it is. But that doesn't, what's that caused by? Well, it's caused by that, but that's correlational. Oh no, it's causal, because there's no other possible thing that they can see as being the reason why that would happen. So that worries me a bit, the whole, so what? This is what it is, and that we're not going any further. There's also the other issue, as I mentioned, the complex storyline issue. You have complex storylines inserted into reality, or they're replacing reality in total due to some kind of random neural error. When it's inserted in, that's your content-specific delusion. The idea that you can, like I said, you're sitting here now, but there's an elephant in the back of the room and it's just looking at me. And I'm thinking, well, I don't think anyone's seeing that elephant, but it's there. But everyone else is just reacting normally to it, as though it's not there. That's been inserted into reality, and I have to account for what that's doing there and how it's there and how it's been seamlessly put into my visual field. So it's not just things from memory either. There's stories of stuff appearing that's novel, that you potentially haven't ever experienced before. People that you see that you haven't seen before. Now, if you were taking that second approach, you'd be saying, oh, no, you've seen them sometime in the past, it's just you don't remember that. And that content and imagery has been planted in your percepts now, and you've just forgotten about it. So nothing's ever novel. Nothing you see is novel. Well, okay, fair enough, you can take that argument. But the other thing that's probably more important is the concept of the brain as a storyteller. So what's happening? The brain is producing this storyline for you. You're completely unaware that it's being produced for you, and it's an hallucination. So what or where is the producer? And this sort of begins to smack of dualism. So we have a consciousness, which is us, self-aware conscious, and we have this subconscious, this hidden conscious, which is producing this material for us. it's not random, because if it's random, it'd be like entopic imagery or just crazy stuff. It's the storyline. It's produced. It's like what Tyrrell was writing about years ago in terms of, you know, the stage hand, the stage carpenter, and the producer in terms of apparitions. Hilary Evans talks about the producer and questioning this kind of, you know, who is the producer of this? Now, you ask again the people who study hallucinations from a neurophysiological point of view and ask them about this, and they go, oh, it's the subconscious. Yeah, but isn't that like saying that there's two brains then? And who is the producer of the subconscious? And you have this infinite regress. Who's producing who for who, and so forth. So there are, I mean, it gets philosophical and awkward and difficult to answer, but it's something that you worry about it because they say, oh, so what? It's dualistic. Yeah, too bad. Because it is what it is. So my argument is that based on my own dissatisfaction with a lot of the explanations of what hallucinations are and how they're produced, there may be, as I'm sort of wrapping up the talk, because this was an introductory talk, we have some room for that first approach again. So we can go back and suggest, well, from a parsimonious point of view, maybe what Tim saw was actually out there. In some ways, it's actually easy to go, yeah, it was actually physically real. It's real in some sense, than to try to say, well, it wasn't real. It was in here, but then I'm having trouble explaining how it happens in here. In some ways, it's easy just to be parsimonious and say maybe it did happen out, and it was the first approach. Something was perceived through the senses. Now, you might have to be a little bit more flexible with the analogies you use. So I've got a very complicated screen here, but what this is just essentially saying, there's lots of little analogies that you're all probably familiar with, which you can use to try to suggest why we're able to pick up more information from out there than we usually do. And we can talk about filter analogies, you know, the idea you have an open or a closed filter. We have a normal state of filtering information from the outside world, which of course, as you know, is this big soup of material out there that we're not necessarily able to perceive. Sometimes the filter might be a little bit more open than normal, and we take in it, and it's energy. When I say energy, it's natural stuff. It doesn't have to, it could be UV light, it doesn't matter what it is, but maybe that kind of information comes in and it's perceived through the normal channels, and we have to interpret it in some way, the brain interprets it in some way, and that's the experience we have. So if our filter is open or it's closed and maybe blocks out a lot of what's out there in the real world and able to receive more subtle information, that's a psi model of filter. Well, you know, we can consider those things. The brain is a receiver, so rather than having a filter that opens and closes, we receive completely different information, and that would best suit a completely altered state of consciousness when, you know, someone's had ayahuasca and they're out there and they're meeting the clockwork dwarves and the mushrooms that talk to them and stuff like that. You know, the reptilians and all the rest. You know, that's receiving a completely different reality. So there are those options. It's still considered to be, from this point of view, passive consciousness. Your consciousness is still passive, and it's receiving information. It's just different information from somewhere else. The jigsaw analogy is what I showed you earlier. It was Charles Tart's one about, you know, maybe you are getting information. It's not just internal cultural information. It's information from elsewhere, not just your personal unconscious, that could be then being perceived in some kind of way. And you might have to talk about additional sensory organs to play around, the pineal gland or something like that, I don't know what, but maybe that's allowing some kind of extra information to come in from the outside world and be perceived and be created wholesale into your experience, which is not necessarily something that you can sort of dismiss as being a hallucination. From that point of view, what is the reality we're talking about here? I've just got some examples here. Here's your, you know, vibrational and etheric theories. You know, the idea that there are higher or lower vibrational states physically that can be picked up in certain ways. I don't like that word because it's not. It's a metaphor for matter that isn't conforming to normal states, because matter that vibrates in different ways can still be measurable. So, etheric or vibrational theories. It's just saying that there's something else out there that we are not able to perceive using our normal sense of consciousness and perceptual organs, but in certain situations, maybe if the receiver's working or the filter's going differently, maybe we can start picking up information like this. Or low energy states. states of such low energy that they're imperceptible unless they get drawn, they draw energy from somewhere, in which case they can start increasing that to a point where you can actually perceive it, which is, again, things we can play around with. One of the most controversial ones that, again, Lance and I talked about last night, the simulation theory, the idea of the reality is a simulation. Of course, you've got to have the simulator who's creating that story for you, but there's no doubt that it opens up ideas here. And metaphors or analogies, analogous theories like this, are really nice. They're ways of trying to formalise these kinds of approaches and maybe look at this particular way of dealing with paranormal experience in a more ordered way, rather than just jump to that conclusion that Tim saw a ghost and it was someone who died years ago and that's what it was. We can start really formalising these kinds of ways of looking at Tim's particular experience. Then we've got what I call the third approach, as I'm just wrapping up the talk now. This is a third approach, and it's all about expanded consciousness. Again, a lot of these concepts are familiar to you, but what I'm trying to do is just trying to summarise it all so we have a different way of looking at it. And here are the analogies I'm mentioning, the iceberg analogy. Well, I mean, the best way to consider that is like Jung's collective unconscious, but of course, Jung and that concept of the collective unconscious, it's not his. A lot of people are using or have used that similar idea of personal unconscious connected through sort of a broader connection to greater consciousness, I guess I'm trying to say. That sort of matches in with what I call the box analogy or higher dimensional states. So you've got ideas of, in three physical dimensions and one dimension at a time, we're in the box. And that's our world. But we can step outside the box if we're in a broader dimensional space and look at the box, so to speak. So that's why I use that as an analogy, because it's a nice way of trying to conceptualise how dimensionality might be able to be visualised in a way that normally you can't visualise it. But from this point of view, what we're trying to say here, it's an expanded type of consciousness. It's the idea that maybe being outside the box, so to speak, or being in tune with other under here in the sort of more, the ground of being, so to speak, you're able to connect with more information, other information. You're more aware of what's around than being in your normal state of consciousness. And that's, again, other approaches which aren't talking at it's real or it's not real. It's a kind of a different kind of real based on this expanded consciousness model. I mean, you might want to go even as far as, discuss concepts of dualism, pure substance dualism, where consciousness is completely separate from the brain. I mean, they need each other in a symbiotic relationship, but you need to put consciousness through the prism of the physical being to then see or have a conscious experience. When the prism is gone or distorted in some way, then consciousness changes. So again, there are problems with that as a purely dualistic model, but again, I think there's a possibility that this third approach is something we have to consider as being an approach rather than just being real or not real, and sort of incorporating that in our future studies of paranormal experiences. So finally, the question is not whether Tim's experience was real or not, it was what type of real was it? And that was where the old Otherreal expression is, and that sort of maintains with the third approach. And that's it. So hopefully, as an introduction, I haven't gone too far over. Cut it down a little bit. Thank you.